Tonight, the theme of this Dharma talk is Buddha's Enlightenment Day, Buddha's Enlightenment itself. Buddha's Enlightenment Day on the Western calendar is celebrated on December 8th, so that was Sunday. And it's traditional in many Zen centers across the world to have long sittings leading up to the Buddha's, midnight on December 8th. In the Quantum School of Zen, we don't generally do that. We do have back at the Providence Zen Center in Rhode Island, we have a ceremony every Buddha's Enlightenment Day. And just so you know, I'll telegraph it. I've been mixing up Buddha's Enlightenment Day and Buddha's birthday in my head for 2 days now. Last night, I even picked a koan to use that was ostensibly for Buddha's Enlightenment Day, but it was actually a Buddha's birthday poem. So that's my little mix-up in my head. But maybe you could say that enlightenment is a new day and is a birthday. So. And there are many places in Asia where they celebrate it all together on one day called Vesak Day, although that's usually in May. So, to be honest with you all, I was a bit dreading to give this talk. I've given a Buddha's Enlightenment Day talk for years and years and years. Every year it comes around, and every year I give the talk, and I was thinking about it and felt totally uninspired. It's like, oh yeah, Buddha's Enlightenment Day again. Maybe it says something that I've been practicing in this school for about 45 years and for even longer. So I'm quite familiar and in some way quite comfortable with the iconography and the mythology, if you will, of Buddhism and Zen. But talking about enlightenment is always a difficult subject because each one of us has our own idea of what enlightenment is. So we use this word and we think we use a word that we're sharing a definition of, but really we don't know what it is. We just have stories that we tell. And often when I think about this, I think of, it's a song by Van Morrison called Enlightenment. And it's got some interesting lyrics, but unintentionally, I think he spoke quite well about enlightenment. He starts off the song and he says, enlightenment, don't know what it is. But if you pause that a little bit differently, it's enlightenment, don't know what it is. So that don't know points us back to before thinking mind, before conceptual ideas. Can we somehow jump out of our conceptual framework and find some freedom and spontaneity in the world as it exists right now? That's really what Buddhism is about. It's really what Zen is about. And it's really what our practice is about. So, and just to contextualize this a little bit more, just imagine as you're listening to this talk that Stuart's death is part of this talk. This life and death coming and going. We don't understand any of it. Especially when someone dies quite suddenly, there are always questions. What? Why? Why are we alive? Why do we die? And death always brings us back to what's the point? What are we doing with our lives? Are we just like robots following our path without thinking, without questioning more than thinking? Or can we take this deep question of not knowing and struggle with it, work with it? What is it? And in essence, that's the pathway of Zen practice, and that's the pathway to the Buddha's enlightenment. So I'm going to tell something of the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. But remember that you're hearing a particular slant on the story. And you could say it's my slant. Factually, it'll include a lot of the things that everybody talks about the Buddha's enlightenment. But whenever any of us tell a story, we shape it and we frame it. And part of this whole question of enlightenment is becoming aware of our framing, becoming aware of how we shape and try to control the narrative to fit some idea that we have. So the man that we now call the Buddha was born into a royal family in a small state in what I suppose he was born in what we call Nepal, but generally speaking, it's spoken about that he was born into a small kingdom in India. And his father was the ruler of this kingdom. And of course, like any father, he had a lot of big ideas about who his son was going to be and what dreams and desires he had for his son. When the Buddha was still yet to be born, there was a prophecy given to the king. And the prophecy was, your son, who will be born, will either be a great ruler of your kingdom, or he might be a religious leader. The king Buddha's father had no desire for his son to be a religious leader. He had every reason to desire that his son would be the king. So, in my slant on the story, this prophecy kind of haunted the father because the father was afraid his dreams weren't going to be fulfilled. So he had to devise a plan. How is he going to push his son into being a king rather than being a religious leader? So in those days, the king lived in this royal palace, and it was a big palace, and there were a lot of, what do they call them, courtiers and people living in the palace. And basically, the palace became the young Buddha's prison. He was very restricted on where he could go, what he could see, and who he could meet with, because his father was afraid that different kinds of meetings might stimulate religious thought and feeling. So his father didn't want his son to know about suffering. He hid his son away from the suffering of the world. He didn't want to show him that people grew old. I'm not sure how he played that one out. I never have been able to figure that out. But he also didn't want his son to see anybody who was sick. He didn't want his son to know about poverty. And he didn't want his son to know about death. So he constructed a world without those things, thinking if he doesn't know about that, nothing will stimulate the religious feeling in him, and he'll just be a good king. One interesting, it's not really a side note, but when Buddha was born, and if you come back again at the beginning of April, maybe it'll be Marshall's week, and he'll get to talk about the Buddha's birthday. But one of the sad facts of the Buddha's birth is that his mother died in childbirth. And it was actually his aunt who raised him. So already he was a baby without the ability to have cognition, and yet he had the deepest ultimate suffering happen before he even understood anything. and he lost his mother. So in my telling of the story, his father was defeated before he even started, because he was born in suffering, just like all the rest of us. So the young Buddha grew up in the palace, and he had every desire he ever could imagine fulfilled. He had a concubine, he had all the best food, he had everything the heart could desire, all with the hope that it wouldn't stimulate any great doubt, any question. And it kind of worked for about 29 years. By that point, when he was 29, I believe it was, he had already been married, and he had a young son. But something started to happen, and he started to have questions. And as I remember it, at least, he and his attendant would somehow slip out of the temple. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. The palace, on successive nights, and go out into town. And suddenly, on the first night, the Buddha saw somebody who was sick. On another night, he saw someone who was poor. Another night, he saw a corpse. And one night, he saw a spiritual person, some mendicant or a monk. And each night, these things just started to fill his mind. And again, in my telling of the story, his father had created this construction of a life that wasn't true and it wasn't real. And at some point, this young man realized that he'd been lied to his entire life. He had been sold a bill of goods. What he believed was the truth was now proven false. And it shook him to his core. In a very similar way, when I was growing up, when I look back now, and I think it just is true for everyone, the way life happens to be, but we're all lied to. We're all told that the world is a certain way. And as we start to get older and we start to see things, we realize that things aren't the way we were told they were. And, each one of us is a product of our time of life. And I was a child of the 1960s. I was 15 years old in 1968. And there was all of this uproar and all of this. And really, the fact was that people a little bit older like me were already dying in a war they didn't want to fight in. And by the time I was a junior and a senior in high school, I was preparing to be drafted. And knowing that I didn't want to go, I had to figure out how to do it. And I was doing draft counseling and the civil rights movement and the women's movement, and all this tumult was going on in society. And in many ways, I had the same feeling that the Buddha had, or that I imagined that the Buddha had, which is everything I've been told is a lie. But I didn't know what the truth was. I just had this feeling that society was built on sand, really, and that everything that holds up our world is actually quite shaky. It didn't help when I went to college, and I studied economics in college, and the first upper division class I took in college in economics was macroeconomics. And on the very first day, the professor presented this proof, this model. And the model had a couple of assumptions. And the first assumption was human beings act in a rational way. I raised my little hand and I said, well, but that's not actually true. And the professor said, yeah, okay, but we're just going to assume it for this model. But this model held up the entire edifice of what they were teaching me over the next 2 years. Now, it's easy to be cynical. It's easy to be sarcastic. I've always expected the whole economy and the whole world to tumble down and fall apart. And I'm getting old and it's still here. So it might have a firmer foundation than I thought. But it all helped to feed my skepticism and my not knowing. Because I more and more came to realize that I didn't know the truth either. So going back to the Buddha, this doubt started to grow. And it got so strong that he decided he had to leave home. And in the mythology of the story, he jumps over the palace walls. And now suddenly he's free. He's free. He's left home. He's become a monastic. He is a person who has left home. But he didn't know what to do. But at that time in India, there was a movement of people leaving home. And they were practicing various forms of yoga and meditation out in the forests. So he went to the forest, and the story goes, for about 6 years, he was searching for the truth. He wanted to find himself. In the thinking of the times, the belief was that in order to free your spiritual body, you almost had to kill your physical body. Of course, you couldn't kill the physical body because then the spiritual body disappears. So they had to get this close to death. And the theory was, boom, your spiritual body would emerge and you would be awake, enlightened, and free. So the Buddha, the young man who we now call the Buddha, was practicing in this style. And he was getting more and more frustrated as he was getting more and more emaciated. Some of you may have seen a picture or a statue of the Buddha in this state. And if you see him, you can see his ribs underneath his skin, and he's like totally emaciated. And this next story I get from the biography of the Buddha by Karen Armstrong. And she says that at that point, he just started to wonder, there's something wrong here. And he had a memory of a time when he was 5 years old. And it was a fall festival in his town, and everybody went out to watch the fields being plowed. He was about 5 or 6 years old, and again, he was this sheltered, protected boy. He was never left alone. There was always somebody with him to tend to his desires and needs. So his caretakers bring him out to the fields with everybody else, and it's quite a festive day. So his caretakers kind of get caught up in the festivities, and suddenly he's there alone underneath what they call a Sharon apple tree. And he remembers that he was looking at the ground, maybe the ground that was being plowed, and he saw that the flowers and the worms were being killed by the movement of the plow. And somehow this arose some compassion in his mind. And the way the story goes, he kind of spontaneously and suddenly sat up straight. It's probably near impossible, it's a story, but he sat as I'm sitting cross-legged, and he entered what in Buddhism they call the jhanas, which are the first jhana, which is a very deep state of concentration and joyfulness. And Then the day ended, he went back to the palace and everything went on. But on this particular night, he said, maybe the mistake we've all been making is that we're fighting our human nature. We're thinking we have to kill ourselves in order to find ourselves. And he said, remembering that day, he said, maybe it's actually natural and part of our humanness to wake up and be enlightened. I personally think this part of the story is very important because probably each one of us would say, oh yeah, of course, you shouldn't be killing yourself in order to find yourself. And yet think about it. How often do you think, if I just got rid of these parts of my character, then I'd be a better person? We also fight a war with our humanness. And whether we really believe it or not, many of us still carry this idea that in order to wake up, we have to kill ourselves. I can't be myself. I have to be some other self. And that's the story we have about enlightenment. Enlightenment means you're some kind of fantasy person rather than fully yourself. Rather than thinking that awakening is awakening our own true nature. We think I have to get rid of something in order to become this thing. So what happened then was that the Buddha decided, I'm going to eat. And the story goes that a young woman carrying milk, some said maybe it was porridge, but she came by and he took some milk and he drank it. And suddenly he started to change. He wasn't starving himself anymore. The 5 people he was practicing with got so disgusted with him for doing this eating that they immediately left him. And he was left to himself. To now, the way Karen Armstrong talks about it, he found the middle way. Not too tight, but also not too loose. And he just started to sit with this question, what am I? And rather than fighting his humanness, he was determined to find what he already was. And then the story goes farther that early the next morning, looking up at the morning star, Venus, he completely shattered his conceptual framework and he woke up and became the Buddha. The word Buddha literally means awakened. So Buddha is the awakened one. And throughout much of at least the 19th and 20th century, people in Asia didn't really believe that Buddha was a real human being. He was a deity like Rama and the other Vishnu and the other deities that they had in their pantheon. And it really wasn't until the British archaeologists started searching in India and they actually found the physical trail of the Buddha and really decided that he actually was a living being and not just a deity that people made up. But as I say that, think of what you make about the Buddha. What's your idea? What's the story that you have that is the fantasy of what awakening is? So when Van Morrison said enlightenment, don't know what it is. So stay with that don't know. So for myself, that not knowing, I didn't have to leap over the palace walls, but I did have to leave the world that was set up for me. I had to find a whole new world. I had to use that question, what am I? Not knowing in order to find a path forward. And it doesn't have to be that dramatic. But if we're going to practice Zen, if we're going to really search out a path forward in our lives that is more compassionate, open, aware, awake, and loving, we have to let go and leave behind the framework that we've set up with the help of everybody else in our cultures in order to protect ourselves from not knowing. When the Buddha let go of the traditions of the day, he was able to find himself. So I think it's a marker for all of us. If you're looking to find your own true nature, you've got to look where you haven't been before. You don't have to leave your own nature, but you have to look in places where you haven't looked before. I can't remember the man, but there are this series of Sufi stories that I heard, and there's a story of this particular subject of these stories, and he's out underneath a light post looking for his keys. And somebody says, "What are you looking for?" He says, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." And they say, "Did you lose them here?" He says, "No, but there's light here so I can look." Crazy. But that's what we do. Rather than going maybe towards the darkness, towards the unexplored, the places that scare us, the places that we've been told, don't go there, it'll ruin your life. If you're really looking for change, if you really want a world that's different, you have to go where you haven't been before. You have to take some risks. You have to wonder, what am I? And follow that to the end.